Caleb had always been a skeptic, no belief in ghosts or the supernatural, but from the moment he moved into the new house on the edge of town, something felt wrong. The basement, in particular, was unsettling. From the very first night, he felt it, a nagging sensation of being watched, as though something unseen lurked just out of sight. At first, it was small things. The sound of faint whispers behind the basement door, the prickling on the back of his neck whenever he passed it. But when he listened, there was nothing, just the creaks of an old house settling into itself, or so he told himself. Then came the footsteps. They always started around midnight, soft at first, just a shuffle as if someone, or something, was pacing below. Caleb would lie in bed, wide awake, straining to listen, but whenever he mustered the courage to go down and check, the basement was empty. Determined to put his mind at ease, Caleb set up a camera to monitor the basement. It was a rational move, he thought. If he could capture whatever was making those sounds, he could prove to himself that it was just a trick of the mind. That night, the house was unnervingly quiet. Even the usual groaning of the old wood had fallen silent, as if the house itself was waiting for something. Midnight came and went, and Caleb lay in bed, staring at his phone's live feed of the basement. The camera showed nothing but the cold, empty stairwell. Then, at exactly 12:47 a.m., the feed flickered. For a moment, Caleb thought it was a glitch, but then the sound returned. The footsteps, only this time, they were louder, more deliberate. His pulse quickened as he turned up the volume, his eyes glued to the screen. There was nothing on the camera. No movement, no shadow, just the sound of heavy steps on the basement stairs, getting closer. The air in his room seemed to thicken as his breath came in shallow bursts. Still, the screen showed nothing. And then, just as the footsteps reached the top of the stairs, the camera feed cut to static. Caleb's phone slipped from his trembling hands. He sat up in bed, his heart thundering in his chest. The house was deathly still. Yet, the oppressive silence made everything worse. It was as if the very air around him was holding its breath, waiting. Against every instinct, Caleb found himself walking toward the basement door, his footsteps echoing loudly in the quiet house. His hand shook as he reached for the doorknob. He hesitated. Something deep inside screamed at him not to open it, but he had to know. Slowly, he turned the knob. The basement was a pit of darkness. The faint light from the hallway barely touched the stairs. He fumbled for the light switch but paused. There was something wrong with the darkness, something heavy, unnatural. His skin tingled, his instincts screaming that he shouldn't go down there. But he flicked on the light. At first, everything seemed normal, just the basement he'd seen 100 times. Old boxes stacked against the wall, scattered tools, and the camera still perched where he'd left it. But then he noticed the door. The door to the crawl space at the far end of the basement, the one he hadn't touched since moving in, was wide open. A cold draft hit him from the darkness beyond. His breath fogged in front of him as he took a step toward the door. With each step, the air grew colder. The darkness at the back of the basement seemed to pulse with a life of its own. And then he saw it. Just beyond the crawl space door, something moved. A shape, barely visible, like a shadow darker than the night itself. It was there, standing still, watching him. His heart stopped. He couldn't see its face, but he knew it was watching. Frozen in place, Caleb's body refused to move, paralyzed by the sheer primal terror that surged through him. The darkness shifted, and then he heard it, an icy whisper, as if spoken directly into his ear. "You shouldn't have come down here." It was enough to break the spell. Caleb turned and bolted for the stairs, his feet slipping on the cold concrete. His hand grasped the railing, pulling himself upward with desperate strength. Behind him, The door to the crawl space slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls. His mind raced. Was it following him? He didn't look back. He couldn't. The basement door slammed shut as he reached the top of the stairs. Caleb locked it, his fingers trembling so badly he could barely manage to turn the key. He stood there, chest heaving, his back pressed against the door. The house was silent again, but the silence felt wrong. It was too thick, too heavy, as if it was pressing down on him. He took a step back, trying to steady his breath, and then the whisper came again, this time from behind him. "Caleb!" His blood ran cold. Slowly, he turned around, his breath catching in his throat. There, in the middle of the living room, stood the figure. Its shape was clearer now, but its face was a void, an emptiness that seemed to pull the very air around it into darkness. It just stood there, staring at him. Caleb's vision blurred as the world seemed to tilt. He blinked, trying to clear his head, but when his eyes focused again, the figure was gone. The room was empty, but the feeling of being watched remained. For a moment, he stood frozen in place. Then, from the hallway, the sound of a door creaking open echoed through the house. His heart nearly stopped. The basement door. The whisper came again, so close it felt like ice on his skin. "You won't escape." What do you make of Caleb's encounter in the basement? Was it simply a case of his mind playing tricks, or did something far more sinister lurk in the shadows? Have you ever felt that eerie sensation of being watched, even when you were alone? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'm curious to hear your experiences. And if Caleb's story made you question what's real and what's not, stay tuned. The next tale, The Last Stop, will take you on a journey that plunges even deeper into the unknown. Believe me, you won't want to miss it. It was nearly midnight when the last train pulled into the station. The platform was empty, save for a few stray papers fluttering in the wind and the dim, flickering lights casting long, eerie shadows. I was alone, waiting for the final train home after a late shift. My phone's battery had died hours ago, and the station's clock seemed to tick slower than usual. I checked the time, midnight, but it felt as if time itself had stalled. As I stepped onto the train, a cold breeze followed me inside, despite the doors hissing shut behind me. I was alone, except for a man sitting several rows ahead, his back turned. His clothes were tattered, his head slightly hunched forward. Something about his stillness made the air around me grow heavy, as if the train was filled with a presence far larger than the two of us. I sat on the opposite side, a few rows back, hoping to avoid any interaction. The train lurched forward, the steady hum of the wheels on the tracks becoming the only sound. Outside, the city lights blurred past, but as I stared through the window, the lights flickered unnaturally, almost as if they were winking out, one by one. I glanced at the man again. He hadn't moved. His stillness, his unnatural calm seemed suffocating. A chill ran down my spine. Something was wrong. My eyes returned to the window, but this time there was nothing outside. The city lights had vanished, replaced by endless darkness. No stations, no buildings, just an infinite void. The train was speeding faster than before, but it felt like it was going nowhere. The uneasy feeling in my gut turned to dread. I looked at the digital clock on the train wall, 12:01 a.m., but it hadn't changed. Time wasn't moving. Panic began to claw at me. I stood up, needing to get out of this car to find someone. I walked toward the front, past the man, and as I approached, I glanced at him again, more out of instinct than curiosity. His head turned slowly. I froze, my pulse quickening. His face, if you could call it that, was a grotesque parody of a human face. Pale, waxy skin stretched too tight over his skull. His eyes were too wide, bulging and unblinking, and his mouth, oh God, his mouth was twisted into a smile far too large for his face, exposing rows of yellow teeth. "Last stop," he rasped. His voice wasn't natural. It was jagged, like rusted metal scraping against bone. My heart thundered in my chest. I bolted for the next car, slamming the door shut behind me, fumbling with the lock, but the train kept speeding up. I ran through the cars, desperate to find anyone, to see some sign of life, but every car was empty, and each door I passed slammed shut with a metallic clang, trapping me further inside. I reached the end of the train, gasping for breath. There was no door, no way out, just a solid wall. I turned around, pressing my back against the cold metal, my breath shaky and erratic. Then I heard it. Tap, tap, tap. The sound came from the door I had just passed through. Slowly it slid open, and there he stood, his head tilted, that grotesque smile plastered on his face. "You missed your stop." He stepped into the car, his tall, gaunt figure almost scraping the ceiling. His limbs moved unnaturally smooth, like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. His two wide eyes locked onto mine as he raised one hand, his fingers far too long, his nails yellow and cracked. I scrambled backward, trying to escape, but there was nowhere to go. His smile widened. As he moved closer, something snapped in my mind. This couldn't be real. None of this could be real. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying to wake up from this nightmare. But the nightmare didn't end. When I opened my eyes, the man was gone. I was standing in the middle of the train again. The lights were dim, and outside, the city lights had returned. Everything seemed normal. Had it been a dream? I exhaled a shaky breath and sat down, trying to calm my racing heart. But then I noticed the time. 12:01 a.m. still, unmoving. And then, as if pulled by an unseen force, my eyes drifted toward the reflection in the window. At first, it was just me, sitting alone. But then I saw it, a figure standing directly behind me. My heart stopped as I slowly turned around. The train was empty, but I could feel him. He was still there, watching. A soft voice whispered in my ear, "You'll never get off this train." And then, the lights flickered once more, plunging me into the dark. If you want to see more horror stories, check out my next video.